If you're around my age, then you probably have at least some affection for the Street Fighter series, and your introduction to it was probably Street Fighter 2. I remember the first time I saw and played Street Fighter 2. It was an arcade cabinet at a local video store around the corner from where I lived, and I'm about 100% sure the store is no longer there. I mean, when was the last time you saw any video store, much less a privately owned independent one? Anyway, the Street Fighter 2 machine was amazing to me, as I'd never seen anything like it before. I mean, I had played fighting games, most notably the side-scrolling beat-em-up Karateka on PC, and the one-on-one fighting game Karate Champ on NES. But those were pretty crappy compared to what I was seeing, and soon enough playing. Over the years, several things about Street Fighter have become confusing. Many people played Street Fighter 2, but at the same time, we questioned whether or not there was an original Street Fighter, as no one had ever seen it. Also, there are various Street Fighter series going on all at once, which can get confusing. And finally, there's the fact that the storyline is all out of order. I know you don't play a game like Street Fighter for the story, but it is there, so I might as well talk about it a bit. When talking about Street Fighter, it seems like a natural starting place to talk about Street Fighter 2. And yeah, there was like 4 million variations of it. But, of course there was a Street Fighter 1. It's not like me and my friends are idiots who think Capcom just decided to start the series with 2, but we figured maybe the original game was only in Japan. There were rumors of Street Fighter 2 that I heard, but pretty much didn't believe at the time, like you could only play as Ryu or Ken. Well, that one turned out to be true. I didn't play the original Street Fighter until years later, and it was on an emulator, not the arcade cabinet, which I have never laid eyes on. And the only home console port was on a system that pretty much nobody I knew had, and they didn't call it Street Fighter. Confusing? Yes. But that's what I'm here for. Another confusing thing is due to the popularity of Street Fighter 2, everybody and their brother was going nuts waiting for Street Fighter 3. But it seemed Capcom wanted to do anything but release Street Fighter 3. They released 1 million updated versions of 2 to the point where it got a bit insane, and then they went into Street Fighter Alpha, Street Fighter EX, Street Fighter vs. X-Men. Yeah, it seems normal now, but it was crazy when I first heard about it, and all sorts of spin-offs. Eventually we did get a Street Fighter 3 and then a 4, and of course, in Capcom traditions, there are multiple updates to them, though not as insane as 2. So let's try and clear it up now. Firstly, I personally recognize Street Fighter as being made out of 4 separate series. There's the original series, which is made of Street Fighters 1 through 4. The Alpha series is 3 games, all of which take place between the first and second game. The Alpha series is the only other series, by the way, which seems to have any impact on the main series storyline. Then there's the EX series, which is in 3D, and the Versus series, which has the Street Fighter characters fighting with or against characters from other franchises. Then, of course, there's spin-offs out the ass, and some of them, like Street Fighter 2010, are really fucked up, but let's talk about the original series first. The reason that many of you never laid eyes on the actual arcade cabinet for Street Fighter, and why it wasn't on most home consoles, was because it wasn't very popular. Street Fighter was a one-on-one fighting game in which you controlled Ryu. You had your choice of going to stages: America, Japan, China, and England. In each stage you would fight 2 warriors. When all 4 stages were completed, you would go to the last stage, Thailand, and fight the last 2 characters, Adon and Sagat, who was fucking impossible. In America, you fought Joe and Mike. In England, it was Birdie and Eagle. In China, it was Lee and Gen. And in Japan, it was Retsu and Geki. If a second player entered, they would control Ken, who was exactly the same as Ryu other than his sprite, and fight against player 1. The only way to play as Ken in single player was to be player 2. Between stages, you'd also do things like break boards as bonus games for points. There were a few different versions of the games. An internal dip switch allowed arcade owners to change how many stages were available at the start. In some versions, you started with only America and Japan, and had to beat them to access China and England, which were considered harder. And in others, you had all 4 stages available to you from the start. There were also 2 distinct arcade cabinets with different controls. One had the now traditional 6-button layout, with 3 punch buttons and 3 kick buttons of varying strengths. Another, earlier version had 2 large buttons. Most people called it the Bubble Edition, because the buttons looked like bubbles. They were pressure sensitive, and the idea was the harder you smack them, the harder your character hits. This was dropped later because arcade cabinets already take a lot of abuse. Asking kids to wail on it to make their characters hit harder is just asking for trouble, and most of them got broken really quickly. For home ports, most of the versions of Street Fighter wound up on PC equivalents such as the ZX Spectrum, the Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, Atari ST, Amiga, and good old DOS. The only console version at the time was on the TurboGrafx 16, the console almost no one had. And to make matters worse, it was on the CD add-on and not the main console. And to make it even more confusing, they changed the name from Street Fighter to Fighting Street. That sounds pretty dumb, like the street is fighting you, whatever. If you want to play the game today for a console and not an emulator, you have a few choices. You can get Capcom Classics Collection Volume 2 for either PlayStation 2 or the original Xbox, which contains the game, or you can get it on the Fighting Street version for the Wii's Virtual Console. Personally, I recommend the collection if you can find it. The game was pretty much a failure, mostly because the controls were really, really bad. Movements were jerky, simple moves were hard to pull off consistently, and special moves, such as the Hadouken, were really hit and miss. The difficulty was also insane, as unless you were able to get off a few successful dragon punches against Sagat, you probably got your ass handed to you every time. Before Street Fighter II, they considered a different type of sequel, a side-scrolling beat-em-up in the style of Double Dragon called Street Fighter 89, referring to the fact that it would have been released in 1989. In this game, you could take control of one of 3 characters and fight street thugs throughout the stage until you got to a boss, rinse, wash, and repeat. Well, the game was shown at trade shows, and the feedback was, it's great, but it has nothing to do with Street Fighter, so they changed the name to Final Fight. Because of the relationship between Street Fighter and Final Fight, a lot of the Final Fight characters have found their way into the Street Fighter series, and some Street Fighter characters have made cameos in Final Fight games. Anyway, Street Fighter II came out a few years later and fixed all of the problems with the first game and then some. It was pretty much the first really good fighting game. You already know about the game, so I'll just go into the different versions. The original was Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. Later on came Street Fighter II Championship Edition, which let you play as the 4 boss characters, and added a few moves and balances. Up next, Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting, which added more moves and a lot of speed to the game. Super Street Fighter II The New Challengers came out, which improved the graphics and added 4 brand new characters. The only problem was it was no longer Turbo, so that necessitated another update, Super Street Fighter II Turbo The Ultimate Championship, which added speed as well as a new hidden boss character, Akuma. That was the last version a lot of people remember, making Street Fighter II its own series with 5 distinct entries, but there's 2 more. The 6th arcade iteration never came out in America, but it was called Hyper Street Fighter II The Anniversary Edition. It later became available in America as part of Street Fighter Anniversary Collection on PlayStation 2 and original Xbox. The most recent version, and hopefully the last one, is Super Street Fighter II Turbo HD Remix, which is considered the now definitive version of the game, which includes more rebalancing, online play, and redrawn graphics by Udon, the company who makes the Street Fighter comic books. This was released for Xbox Live Arcade and the PSN, making it the first version of the game to be exclusive to home consoles. For home ports, the original World Warrior game was on PC, Super NES, and Game Boy, and later found its ways into collections for PlayStation, Saturn, PS2, Xbox, and also the Wii Virtual Console. Championship Edition and Hyper Fighting usually go together. On the Super NES and Genesis, you got both as one release. Championship Edition did come out on its own for the TurboGrafx 16, but only in Japan, and oddly enough also saw a release on the Master System. It also was part of collections for PlayStation, Saturn, PS2, and Xbox. Turbo came out for Super NES and Genesis, as I mentioned, though on the Genesis it was called Special Championship Edition. It also came out for all the typical collections and Xbox Live Arcade. Super Street Fighter II came out for Super NES, Genesis, and PC, and all the collections. Super Turbo mostly is only on the collections, but there were 2 home versions. Oddly, they're for the 3DO and the Game Boy Advance. On the Game Boy Advance, it's given the title Super Street Fighter II X Revival. It was also on the Dreamcast, but only in Japan, using its Japanese name, Super Street Fighter II-X Grandmaster Challenge, and the added bit for matching service on the Dreamcast. Hyper Street Fighter II has only ever been an arcade and the Anniversary Collection for PS2 and Xbox. Damn, okay. When talking about Street Fighter III, a lot of people, it seems, are unaware now that there were multiple versions of the game, and it seems most people know just one version, Third Strike. Actually, the third part of that doesn't refer to it being the third Street Fighter game, but rather the third version of Street Fighter III. The first version was called Street Fighter III The New Generation. It had 10 playable characters and a boss. Pretty simple stuff. The second version was Street Fighter III Second Impact Giant Attack, and added a few new characters and slight touch-ups to the balance and graphics. The third version is the one you're probably familiar with, Street Fighter III Third Strike Fight for the Future. This version overhauled the graphics, put in new backgrounds, the grading system, the sound and the music was changed, the game played differently, and was pretty much almost an entirely new game. Even the endings were different, which were the same in the first two versions. So far, Fight for the Future is the last version of Street Fighter III, which is pretty good as most fighting game fans consider it to be perfect, and one of the best fighting games ever made. For home ports, the only way to play the first two games is on the Dreamcast, in the collection Street Fighter III Double Impact. Neither game has ever been released for any other home console. Third Strike was also released for the Dreamcast. It was one of the first games I ever got for the system, and it had also been on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox for Anniversary Collection, and on the PS2 by itself in Japan. Street Fighter IV has also seen a few versions, though you're probably familiar with them. I'll go over it quickly for posterity's sake. The original Street Fighter IV came out in the arcade, and then later for the 360, PlayStation 3, and PC, though the home versions were superior and had more characters. Later on came Super Street Fighter IV, which added an assload of new characters and features, which was exclusive to PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 at first, but later it hit arcades with 4 new characters that were exclusive and more rebalances. Then came Super Street Fighter IV 3D Edition for the 3DS, and finally the updated arcade version was brought home for 360, PlayStation 3, and PC as Super Street Fighter IV Arcade Edition. The Alpha series is made up of 3 games and takes place between Street Fighter and Street Fighter II. What's interesting is that the second and third games are seen as being canon, as the second game is considered by many to be a remake of the first one. What's also interesting is that in Japan, Street Fighter Alpha is called Street Fighter Zero. I'm glad they changed it, because when you hear Zero, you think of it as taking place before the first game, not after it. The first game was Street Fighter Alpha Warrior's Dreams, the second was Street Fighter Alpha 2, and the third is Street Fighter Alpha 3. It seems pretty normal and straightforward, but there are multiple versions, so let's get into that. Thankfully, there's no updated version of Street Fighter Alpha, although most people consider 2 to be the updated version, as it tells the same story. The home versions include PC, PlayStation, and Saturn, and later on it found a home on the Game Boy Color. Alpha 2 was released on PlayStation, Saturn, and PC as well, and oddly enough, the Super NES, even though the first game was never on there. There was an updated version called Street Fighter Alpha 2 Dash, which was exclusive to PlayStation and added a new character and a few tweaks. This was at first only released in Japan, obviously as Street Fighter 02 Dash, but later it came to America as part of Street Fighter Collection for PlayStation and Saturn, where it was called Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold. And later on, it was released in Japanese arcades as Street Fighter 02 Alpha. Yeah, it's not too confusing. Jeez. 3 has also seen multiple versions. The original Street Fighter Alpha 3 came out in the arcades and was later released for PlayStation and Dreamcast. Both home versions added a lot of tweaks and a few new characters, which came back in a new arcade version called Street Fighter 03 Upper. Obviously from the name, it only came out in Japan. That, oddly enough, saw a release on the Saturn, only in Japan, but later it made an American debut on the Game Boy Advance. The last version of the game is Street Fighter Alpha 3 Max on the PlayStation Portable, which added more characters and tweaks. The last Alpha release was Street Fighter Alpha Anthology on PlayStation 2, which includes all 3 games, as well as a spin-off game and unlockable updated versions of 2 and 3. The EX series of 3D fighters has ended long ago and is considered today to be crappy, though at first it was fairly interesting. There were only 3 games, though the first 2 did see some updates. The first 2 games were released in arcades as Street Fighter EX and Street Fighter EX2. The first game got an update called Street Fighter EX Plus, and the home version for PlayStation was further updated, and it was called Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha. Yeah, there's that Alpha thing cropping up again. The second game got an updated version called Street Fighter EX2 Plus, which also came out for PlayStation. The third and final game, Street Fighter EX3, never came out in arcades. It was exclusive to PlayStation 2, and it was a colossal failure, pretty much killing the series. What's interesting about the EX games is although they have a lot of the familiar faces you'd expect, there were a lot of new characters included that have only ever appeared in the EX games. Finally, there's the Versus series, which in itself can be broken down into several series if you'd like, depending on who they're crossing over with. The first to talk about is the crossovers with Marvel. Yeah, it seems weird, but at the time, Capcom had the Marvel license. They first made a fighting game called X-Men Children of the Atom. It's not part of the Versus series, but it's sort of the original game in the series nonetheless, as future games would be based off of the gameplay from this title, and the sprites would get reused over and over again. And yeah, although it was an X-Men game, Capcom snuck the Street Fighter character Akuma in there as a hidden character. After that came Marvel Super Heroes, which was pretty much an updated version of X-Men with some new gameplay mechanics, a new story, and characters other than the X-Men. But in a lot of ways, it was the same basic game. Once again, it contained a hidden character, but this time it was Anita from the Darkstalker series. Anita, I think, was not meant to be discovered, as she's glitchy and unfinished, and even turns into Akuma for a few frames of animation sometimes. Well, next Capcom bit the bullet and released what at the time seemed like the dumbest idea ever, X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Yeah, it sounds dumb, but it played great and it was a huge hit, which led to an entire series of Marvel and Capcom crossovers. After this, they figured why not include other Marvel characters, and they released Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter, the game that a lot of people seem to forget about. Next, they expanded the Street Fighter side to include other Capcom properties, and out came Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of the Superheroes, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 New Age of Heroes, and recently Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Fate of Two Worlds. While so far there hadn't been any updated versions of these games, that's soon to end, as Capcom has announced Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 to be released later this year. For home ports for all the games I mentioned, X-Men Children of the Atom came out for the Saturn, PlayStation, and PC. Marvel Super Heroes came out for PlayStation as well, and the Saturn only in Japan. X-Men vs. Street Fighter also came out for the PlayStation and the Saturn in Japan only. Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter, same deal, the PlayStation, and in Japan, the Saturn. Marvel vs. Capcom came out for PlayStation and Dreamcast, though I have to say if you want to play the game, get the Dreamcast one. The PlayStation version sucks. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 came out for Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, Xbox, PlayStation Network, and Xbox Live Arcade. The physical releases are all really rare, especially the PlayStation 2 version, so you might want to stick to the Xbox Live Arcade and PSN versions for this. And finally, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 was a console exclusive for Xbox 360 and PS3, and I assume Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 will also be for those systems. Also in the Versus series are the Capcom vs. SNK games. Now these are interesting because some of them have been released by Capcom and some by SNK. It seems they've alternated between making games, and some of them are card-based RPGs that came out for handheld systems that are based on the Capcom vs. SNK series. First, let's talk about the fighting games. The first game was Capcom vs. SNK Millennium Fight 2000, which finally let the Street Fighter fans and the King of Fighters fans hash it out in one game. The original version came out for arcade and was released for Dreamcast. There was an updated version called Capcom vs. SNK Millennium Fight 2000 Pro, which was a home console exclusive for Dreamcast and PlayStation. The second game has seen multiple versions. The original arcade game is Capcom vs. SNK 2 Mark of the Millennium 2001. There was a version for Dreamcast which only came out in Japan, which is a damn shame as I have it and it's fucking awesome. Import it if you can. The Dreamcast is region-free. The game was later released for PlayStation 2. After this, there was a new version of the game called Capcom vs. SNK2 EO for Xbox and GameCube. A lot of people have wondered what EO stands for, and the answer depends on where you live. In Japan, they say it stands for Easy Operation, as it included ways to map special moves to single buttons or directional inputs. However, in America, it's said to stand for Extreme Offense. Whatever. Both of those games were made by Capcom. Alternating with those games were SNK's games. The first one was SNK vs. Capcom, The Match of the Millennium. Yeah, that's not too confusing, give it almost identical titles to the two Capcom games. However, you can't confuse it too much as this one was only released for Neo Geo Pocket Color. Oh well. SNK's second attempt was SNK vs. Capcom SVC Chaos. This one is a real bitch for me as I've never gotten to play it. It's so ridiculously rare and incredibly hard to emulate. If anybody has a copy they want to part with, let me know. Anyway, this one was originally released for the Neo Geo, both the arcade and home versions, and then later came out for PlayStation 2 and Xbox. By the way, the PlayStation 2 one is the one I'm after. The card-based RPG part of it has 3 games. The first is SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters Clash for Neo Geo Pocket Color, though there were 2 versions of that, a Capcom version and an SNK version, kind of like the multiple versions of Pokemon. The second game is SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters 2 Expand Edition on the Neo Geo Pocket Color and only in Japan. The third game is SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters DS for, well, the DS. Another Versus game is the crossover with Tatsunoko. Tatsunoko Production is a Japanese animation company that have made a hell of a lot of anime, usually having to do with superheroes. There are actually 2 versions of the game. The first is Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Cross Generation of Heroes, which was only released on the Wii and only in Japan. The updated version featured some new characters and, oddly enough, took one out, and was called Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Ultimate All-Stars. This also came out for the Wii and also was released in arcades. We didn't get the arcade version, but we did get the Wii version. The Versus series doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. For ages, people wanted a Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but it didn't happen due to Capcom ending their relationship with Marvel. But recently it has happened, and although they haven't crossed over with SNK since SVC Chaos, Capcom is now crossing over with Namco. What's interesting is, it won't be for the first time, as in Japan there was a game called Namco Cross Capcom for the PlayStation 2. It wasn't a fighting game, however, as it was more of a strategy-based RPG with some action elements added in. But soon enough, you'll see the release of Street Fighter Cross Tekken and Tekken Cross Street Fighter. Street Fighter Cross Tekken is being made and released by Capcom, while Tekken Cross Street Fighter is being made and released by Namco. Both versions will be home console only, being released for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, while Street Fighter Cross Tekken is also being released for the PlayStation Vita. Well, that's the 4 main aspects of the world of Street Fighter: the original series, the Alpha series, the EX series, and the Versus series. As far as the storyline goes, it gets a bit confusing, but the first thing you do is throw out the Versus games and the EX games right out the window. All of the Alpha games take place between Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2, and the first one really doesn't count. The weirdness expands to Street Fighter 4, which oddly takes place between Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 3. Consider this: the Alpha games are called the Zero games in Japan. This means the order of games for the story would be 1, 0, 2, 4, 3. Yeah. All those times you thought it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but Capcom just plays by their own rules. As for all the other Street Fighter games, I don't want to get too much into the spin-offs, because there's nothing that's very confusing. They're all obviously spin-offs, and that's easy to deal with. There's only a few minor things I want to get into. The first is Street Fighter 2010, The Final Fight for NES. This game takes place in what was then considered the far future of 2010, which is now literally considered so last year. The story goes that after becoming the best Street Fighter ever, Ken becomes a scientist, and then some crazy shit with aliens happens or some shit, and he goes around fighting mutants in a high-tech suit of armor. Well, throw this one out the window. It actually has nothing to do with Street Fighter. In Japan, the game may be called 2010 Street Fighter, but it's generally understood to not be related to Street Fighter. The main point of contention is Ken and his backstory as a Street Fighter, which was added to the American release to tie it into the Street Fighter games. Which is really weird when you think about it, as it came out a year before Street Fighter 2. So most people didn't know about the series, and even if they did, Ken was fairly obscure anyway, as he was only used for Player 2 in the original game. In Japan, the character in Street Fighter 2010 is named Kevin Straker, and he wasn't a former Street Fighter who turned into a scientist who turned into a cyborg warrior guy. He was a cyborg cop. The other spin-off to mention is the game based on the Street Fighter movie. Oh, man. Remember that? That movie was so terrible that it's hilarious. I actually really enjoy it because it's so ridiculous you can't take it seriously. And the idea of a game based on the movie, which is based on a game, that's just fucking comedy gold. Especially considering that the game contains digitized sprites, which makes it look a lot more like Mortal Kombat, and most people consider it to be mind-bendingly awful. Well, I gotta tell you a few things about it. Firstly, get ready for it, there are actually 2 separate versions of the game. Yeah. I know you're laughing, you should be, it's fucking funny. The first version was the arcade game, which actually does play a lot like Mortal Kombat. So remember, if you're going to talk about how shit it is, you're pretty much bashing Mortal Kombat as well. The second version was the home one. It has the same exact title, but is a completely different game. It looks similar, but trust me, it's not the same game at all. This one came out for PlayStation and Saturn. I actually have it for Saturn, and it's nothing more glorious than Street Fighter 2 Turbo with different sprites and a story mode based on the movie. Actually, it's a little more advanced than Street Fighter 2 Turbo, as it has Cammy, DJ, and Akuma, as well as a character from the movie, Captain Sawada. But the character Blade from the arcade game is not included. These games are so weird. Not only is the concept of making a game based on a movie which was based on a game strange, but the inclusion of Akuma always baffled me as he wasn't even in the movie. Once again, it's got a bad rap because of how weird it is, but remember, if you're going to bash it, you're basically bashing Street Fighter 2 Turbo. I've played it. It's not a bad game. Just a really, really fucking weird one. The last thing to talk about is the game Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, which is a Street Fighter-based puzzle game. The only confusing thing about it is the name, which suggests that it's an update of a sequel to a puzzle fighter. But in fact, it's the only one. They just thought it would be funny to call it that. That's right, Capcom were making fun of themselves. Well, that's pretty much all I have to talk about, and all I can think of that's confusing for Street Fighter. Join me next time and we'll talk about the Square Enix merger. Yeah, I'm right about it and you're wrong. Find out why next week.